On a Wednesday morning in September 2016, federal agents surrounded a sprawling colonial mansion at 6 Birch Hill Court in Old Westbury, Long Island. Victoria Gotti wasn't home when they arrived with search warrants from the Brooklyn U.S. Attorney's Office. The television cameras that had once filmed her glamorous life for the reality show Growing Up Gotti were long gone. In their place came investigators from the IRS, moving through rooms that still held the ghosts of a family's 30-year residency. Within hours, the Gotti family would abandon this 6,000-square-foot estate forever, leaving behind thousands of dollars worth of designer clothes hanging in closets, family photos scattered across marble countertops, and a secret room hidden behind a bookshelf in the guest house. The mansion, which had cost millions to build and decorate, would sit untouched for the next 6 years, slowly decaying into one of Long Island's most infamous abandoned properties. But to understand how a property once valued at $3.5 million could end up selling at foreclosure for just over $1 million, you need to know the story of the man whose last name made this house both a palace and a prison. The Gotti name carried weight in New York City like few others. John Joseph Gotti Jr. was born on October 27, 1940, in the Bronx, the fifth of 13 children in a family so poor that his father's sporadic work as a day laborer barely kept food on the table. Young John grew up watching his father struggle, and he resented the old man for not being willing to do whatever it took to provide better. By age 12, Gotti was running with street gangs in East New York, befriending future mobsters like Angelo Ruggiero and Wilfred Willie Boy Johnson. At 14, he tried to steal a cement mixer from a construction site, but the heavy machinery fell and crushed his toes, giving him a permanent limp that would mark him for life. He dropped out of Franklin K. Lane High School at 16 and never looked back, joining the Fulton Rockaway Boys, a gang with direct connections to the Gambino crime family. This was the late 1950s, when organized crime in New York operated with the efficiency of a Fortune 500 company and the ruthlessness of a medieval kingdom. By the time John Gotti met Victoria DeGiorgio at a bar in 1958, he was already knee-deep in the life. Victoria was half Italian, half Russian, beautiful, and according to FBI documents, had been married once before with one child. They married on March 6, 1962, and would have 5 children together. Though tragedy would mark their family when their 12-year-old son Frank was killed in a motor vehicle accident in March 1980. Gotti attempted to work legitimate jobs briefly in the early 60s, pressing coats in a factory and driving trucks as an assistant. But legitimate work paid pennies compared to what he could make hijacking trucks at Idlewild Airport, which would later be renamed John F. Kennedy Airport. By 1966, at age 26, he'd already been jailed twice, and there was no pretending anymore. John Gotti had chosen his path, and he was going to walk it all the way to the top. The 1970s and 80s were Gotti's rise to power. He worked under the wing of Aniello Neil Della Croce, the underboss of the Gambino family, operating out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens. In 1973, Gotti was part of a hit team sent to kill an Irish mobster named James McBratney, who had murdered a nephew of Gambino boss Carlo Gambino. The hit went sideways when they tried to arrest McBratney while posing as cops in a Staten Island bar. When McBratney resisted, Gotti's accomplice shot him dead in front of witnesses. Gotti was arrested in June 1974 and faced life in prison. But through the help of notorious attorney Roy Cohn, he managed to plead down to attempted manslaughter and served only 4 years. When he got out in 1977, he was a made man in the Gambino family, formally inducted into the organization with all the rights and responsibilities that came with it, and Gotti wasn't content to be just another soldier. He wanted more. He wanted everything. The Gambino family in the 1980s was the most powerful criminal organization in America. generating an estimated $500 million per year through construction racketeering, loan sharking, gambling operations, labor union control, hijacking, and despite official prohibition, drug trafficking. When Carlo Gambino died in 1976, he appointed his brother-in-law, Paul Castellano, as boss, passing over the more deserving Agnello Della Croce. This decision created a rift in the family that would have deadly consequences. Castellano, known as Big Paul, lived in a mansion on Staten Island called the White House and ran the family like a corporate CEO, distancing himself from the street-level crews. He wore expensive suits, held meetings in legitimate-looking offices, and strictly forbade family members from dealing drugs because the harsh prison sentences often turned mobsters into government informants. Many of the younger, hungrier members of the family, including John Gotti, saw Castellano as out of touch, greedy, and weak. By 1985, the tension had reached a breaking point. In February of that year, Gotti and several of his crew were indicted for dealing heroin. Castellano was furious and, according to sources within the family, was planning to kill Gotti and his brother Gene for violating the drug prohibition. Then, in December 1985, Gotti's mentor, Agnello Della Croce, died of cancer. Castellano refused to attend the funeral, which Gotti viewed as the ultimate sign of disrespect. 2 weeks later, on December 16, 1985, at exactly 5:25 in the evening, Paul Castellano and his bodyguard, Thomas Bellotti, pulled up to Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan for a dinner meeting. As they stepped out of their Lincoln town car onto East 46th Street, 4 men in identical trench coats and fur hats materialized from the sidewalk crowd. The gunmen opened fire with semi-automatic weapons, hitting Castellano 6 times and Bellotti 4 times, killing both men instantly in front of dozens of witnesses. John Gotti watched the execution from a parked car across the street, accompanied by his capo Salvatore, Sammy the Bull, Gravano. When he was certain both men were dead, Gotti had his driver cruise slowly past the scene. Within hours, he had seized control of the Gambino family. What made John Gotti different from every mob boss before him was his relationship with publicity. Traditional mafia leaders lived in the shadows, conducting business quietly and avoiding media attention at all costs. Gotti did the opposite. He dressed in $2,000 Brioni suits, held court at the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, and smiled for cameras whenever reporters showed up. He became a celebrity gangster, the dapper Don who looked like he'd stepped off the pages of GQ magazine rather than out of a Queen Street gang. When he went to trial in 1986 on federal racketeering charges, he walked into the courthouse like a movie star, waving to crowds of supporters who had gathered outside. The trial ended in acquittal after it was later revealed that the jury foreman had been paid $60,000 to deadlock the jury. A second trial in 1987 for assaulting a union official also ended in acquittal. The press dubbed him the Teflon Don because no charges seemed to stick. Law enforcement was humiliated, and John Gotti was at the height of his power, earning somewhere between $5 million and $20 million per year and running the most profitable criminal empire in the United States. But while John Gotti was building his empire in Manhattan and Queens, his daughter Victoria was trying to build a life of her own. Born on November 27, 1962, in Brooklyn, Victoria grew up in the family's modest 2-story house in Howard Beach, Queens. Despite what people assumed, the Gotti children didn't grow up in luxury. John Gotti was an earner and a spender, not a saver. And his legitimate cover was running a plumbing supply company that barely made money. Victoria has said that she spoke very little as a child, and her parents worried she might be autistic. But she grew into an intelligent, articulate young woman who loved to read and write. She attended St. John's University in New York and later worked as a reporter for the New York Post and for New York's Fox flagship station. She had ambitions beyond being just a mobster's daughter. But those ambitions would be complicated by the man she fell in love with as a teenager. His name was Carmine Agnello, and he was exactly the kind of man John Gotti didn't want his daughter to marry. Carmine was born around 1960 in Ozone Park, Queens, the same neighborhood where Gotti operated. He ran a scrap metal recycling business, which sounded legitimate on paper, but was actually a front for various criminal schemes involving stolen cars, VIN tampering, and illegal vehicle dismantling. In 1979, according to testimony given in a 2007 court case, the 20-something Carmine made a terrible mistake. He got into a fight with Victoria and assaulted her physically. When John Gotti found out, he was enraged. Several Gambino associates ambushed Agnello on a Queen Street, beat him with a baseball bat, and then shot him in the buttocks to send a message. You didn't put your hands on a mob boss's daughter and walk away unscathed. Most men would have taken the hint and disappeared. Carmine Agnello, either brave or stupid, kept pursuing Victoria. They started dating in secret, and despite her father's vocal disapproval, they were married on March 6, 1984, when Victoria was 21 years old. John Gotti never warmed to his son-in-law. In wiretapped conversations from prison years later, Gotti would mock Agnello mercilessly, calling him an imbecile, and joking that Carmine was so dumb he probably gets in the back seat of the car and thinks someone has stolen the steering wheel. He would pretend to read from Agnello's criminal record, listing fake charges like malicious mopery, possession of brains with intent to use, stolen bumper, hubcap. Even Gotti's brother Peter and other family members would laugh along as John ridiculed the man who had married his daughter. But Victoria loved Carmine, or at least she believed she did, and in 1989, the couple moved into a 5-bedroom mansion in Old Westbury, a wealthy village in Nassau County on Long Island's North Shore. This was the beginning of what would become one of the most famous mob-connected properties in American history. The Old Westbury Mansion wasn't completed in its final form until 1996, 4 years after John Gotti had already been sentenced to life in prison. Carmine and Victoria spent years and substantial amounts of money turning the property into a neoclassical colonial showpiece. The main house stretched across somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 square feet, depending on which source you consulted. The centerpiece of the home was a dramatic butterfly double staircase that curved up from a grand foyer lined with marble floors and floor-to-ceiling built-in bookshelves. Gold-trimmed chandeliers hung from high ceilings. The 5 bedrooms each had its own bathroom. Plus, there was an additional half-bath for guests, and every room was decorated with the kind of opulence that Victoria would later describe as Ritz-Carlton style. The master bedroom featured a platform bathtub surrounded by pink marble, with gilded taps shaped like something from a European palace, flanked by enormous mirrors and a gold-framed glass shower enclosure that probably cost more than most people's cars. The bedrooms had 4-poster beds with ornate pillars, and throughout the house, fine wood paneling gave every room a warm, elegant feeling that was simultaneously comfortable and intimidating. But the real extravagance was outside. The property sat on 2 acres of manicured grounds and included amenities that would make a resort jealous. There was a triple-level hot tub and pool complex with a swim-up bar, designed so that you could literally swim to the bar and order a drink without ever leaving the water. Waterfalls cascaded into the pool from decorative rock formations. A full-sized basketball court sat on one side of the property, perfect for the 3 Gotti boys who would grow up here. A horse stable with room for multiple animals included an unfinished in-law apartment on the 2nd floor, as if they were planning to house extended family or staff permanently on the property. There was a tennis court, a 4-car detached garage, a pond, and a separate guest house that would later become famous for what it concealed. The guest house was a two-story structure that matched the main house architecturally, and it included its own pool house facilities and living quarters. On the second floor of that guest house, built into the wall behind floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, was a secret room with a keypad locking mechanism. Most people who visited the property never knew it existed. Victoria and Carmine had 3 sons together, born in rapid succession. Carmine Jr. arrived on April 8, 1986, followed by John on May 5, 1987, and Frank on April 12, 1990. Victoria named 2 of her sons after her brothers, John and Frank, the latter of whom had died in that tragic accident when he was only 12 years old. Before the boys were born, Victoria had suffered through a devastating loss. 9 months after her wedding, she gave birth to a stillborn daughter named Justine. Doctors told her she wouldn't be able to conceive again because they had found cancer developing in her uterus. The incident traumatized Victoria so deeply that decades later, when Lifetime wanted to include the scene in her biopic, she refused. "I didn't want that scene in there," she told interviewers. "That was very painful to me. And it's not about having to explain it or not wanting to explain it. I just felt like it's mine, not yours. You didn't know her." But somehow, miraculously, Victoria did conceive again, and her 3 sons became the center of her world. The family lived in the old Westbury Mansion through the 1990s and into the 2000s, even as their world fell apart around them. In 1992, John Gotti was convicted on multiple charges, including 5 counts of murder, racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, tax evasion, illegal gambling, extortion, and loan sharking. The key to his conviction was testimony from his former underboss, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, who had agreed to cooperate with the government after FBI surveillance tapes caught Gotti trash-talking him and trying to frame him for various crimes. Gravano's testimony was devastating. He confirmed that John Gotti was the boss of the Gambino family and described in detail the conspiracy to murder Paul Castellano, giving a full account of the Sparks Steakhouse hit and its aftermath. On April 10, 1992, Gotti was found guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Teflon Don had finally been coated with Velcro, and the FBI celebrated what they called the end of John Gotti's reign. He would die in prison 10 years later on June 10, 2002, from complications related to throat cancer. He was 61 years old. While her father rotted in a federal prison cell, Victoria tried to create a normal life for her boys in Old Westbury. She decorated the mansion with warmth and style, filling the bookshelves with hundreds of volumes, hanging family photos on the walls, and making sure her sons had everything they needed. The property became the site of family gatherings, holiday celebrations, and birthday parties. Kim Gotti, who was married to Victoria's brother, John Jr. Gotti, would later remember those days fondly. "It was magnificent. It was gorgeous," she told reporters. "It was where all the holidays were. Christmas, Thanksgiving, Easter. It's amazing how life just goes so quick." The mansion was where the family tried to pretend that they were just another wealthy Long Island family, not the children and grandchildren of America's most famous mob boss. But that illusion would become impossible to maintain, especially after Carmine Agnello's criminal activities caught up with him. Carmine had never been able to stay out of trouble. His temper was legendary, and his judgment was questionable at best. On February 5, 1994, Carmine was at his scrapyard in Queens when a police officer began ticketing cars parked illegally outside. Instead of letting it go, Carmine came out to argue with the cop. Then, In a move that defied all logic, he got into his Ford Bronco and rammed the officer's police scooter, pushing it 15 feet down the street. He was arrested and charged with criminal mischief. In June of the same year, he and several other Gambino members got into a brawl with police at the same location, again over parking tickets, and Carmine was arrested again. 3 years later, on June 6, 1997, he was arrested for assault after beating a former employee with a telephone. The victim later dropped the complaint, probably out of fear. But the pattern was clear. Carmine Agnello was a violent, impulsive man who couldn't control himself even when the consequences were obvious. The arrests that would end Carmine's freedom came on January 20th, 2000. Federal prosecutors charged him with racketeering and arson after an elaborate sting operation. Undercover officers from the New York Police Department had set up a fake scrap metal business in Willets Point, Queens, right in the heart of the area where Carmine operated. The plan was to catch car thieves and chop shop operators, but they hooked a much bigger fish. Carmine wanted to control the entire scrap metal business in the area, and when the undercover operation refused to sell their scrap to him at below market prices, he decided to use the tactics that had always worked before. According to testimony presented in court, Carmine promised a cooperating witness $2,000 to buy glass bottles, fill them up with gasoline, and throw them all around the truck of the undercover operation. He was trying to firebomb a police sting without knowing it was a police sting. The feds arrested him and charged him with racketeering, extortion, arson, VIN fraud, and income tax evasion. His defense attorneys tried to claim that Carmine suffered from bipolar disorder and that his medication led to bad judgment. But the evidence was overwhelming. On August 16, 2001, Carmine accepted a plea bargain. On October 26, 2001, he stood in front of a federal judge in the Eastern District of New York and was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison. He was also ordered to forfeit $10 million in assets to the court and to pay $950,000 in restitution to his victims. John Gotti, watching all of this from his prison cell, must have felt vindicated in his low opinion of his son-in-law. "He's built himself a gallows," Gotti had said during one of Victoria's visits. "He's bought the noose." Carmine was sent to a federal prison in Youngstown, Ohio, to serve his sentence. Victoria visited him for a while, trying to maintain the marriage, but the strain was too much. In 2003, after 19 years of marriage, and while Carmine was still behind bars, Victoria filed for divorce on grounds of constructive abandonment. The legal term essentially meant that Carmine had abandoned the marriage by failing to fulfill his duties as a husband, including the most intimate aspects of their relationship. The divorce was granted, and Victoria was awarded the old Westbury Mansion, along with $12,500 per month in alimony and another $12,500 per month in child support for their 3 sons. The total divorce settlement package was estimated at $7 million. After years of living in the shadow of her mobster father and her criminal husband, Victoria Gotti was finally on her own. This was when Victoria decided to step into the spotlight in a way she never had before. In 2004, the A&E network premiered a reality television show called Growing Up Gotti, which would run for 3 seasons and 41 episodes until December 2005. The show was filmed primarily at the old Westbury Mansion, and it gave America an inside look at Victoria's life as a single mother, raising 3 teenage sons with the last name Gotti. The premise was simple but compelling. Cameras followed Victoria and her boys, Carmine Jr., John, and Frank, through their daily lives. Episodes showed Victoria trying to sell the mansion to get over the ghost of her marriage, going on blind dates arranged by celebrity matchmakers, dealing with her son's requests for ATVs and tattoos, throwing elaborate dinner parties, and managing a household filled with drama and testosterone. The boys were portrayed as typical teenagers who happened to be ridiculously good-looking and have the most famous mob name in America. They got into minor trouble, chased girls, worked out constantly, and spoke in thick Long Island accents that made every sentence sound like it might end in a fight. The show was a hit, at least initially. It tapped into America's enduring fascination with mob culture, while presenting the Gottis as surprisingly normal people who just happened to have an unusual family history. Victoria narrated each episode, describing her life and her sons with a mixture of pride and exasperation. The mansion itself became a character on the show. Cameras lingered on the butterfly staircase, the gold chandeliers, the opulent bathrooms, and the pool complex with its multiple levels and swim-up bar. Viewers got to see the Ritz-Carlton decor that Victoria had spent years creating, all the fine wood paneling and marble and carefully chosen furniture. The show took the family to Italy to explore their heritage, showed Frankie opening a tanning salon business, and documented John's high school graduation. Supporting characters included Robert, Victoria's gay best friend who provided comic relief, and Uncle Pete, John Gotti's brother, who would challenge the boys to paintball wars and boxing matches. In November 2014, A&E aired a one-hour anniversary special called Growing Up Gotti 10 Years Later, which reunited the family to talk about highlights from the series and what they'd been doing since. But reality television success couldn't protect the family from their past or from the consequences of their choices. Carmine Agnello was released from federal custody on January 16, 2008, after serving approximately 7 years of his 9-year sentence. He'd received credit for good behavior, which was ironic given his long history of bad behavior. After his release, Carmine quietly remarried, this time to a woman named Danielle Vangar. Danielle was the daughter of Mus Topalian, a former leader in the world of Armenian terrorism who had been convicted by the U.S. government in 1999 for conspiracy, storage, and possession of explosives and weapons. Carmine apparently had a type. He liked marrying the daughters of dangerous men. The couple settled in Bentleyville, an affluent suburb of Cleveland, Ohio, where Carmine listed Danielle as the owner of a new scrap metal business. He was back to his old tricks, running the same kinds of operations that had gotten him in trouble before. In July 2015, federal and state authorities in Cleveland arrested Carmine Agnello again. The charges this time included theft, money laundering, conspiracy, and, bizarrely, drugging his own racehorses with performance-enhancing drugs. The investigation, cleverly named Operation Goodfella, had been ongoing for 18 months and revealed that Carmine was running a $3 million stolen car and scrap metal scam. Police alleged that Carmine was paying neighborhood teenagers to steal cars and bring them to his business. He would then crush the stolen vehicles and, in an attempt to illegally increase their weight and therefore their value, fill them with dirt before taking them to scrap metal processing facilities. He allegedly bribed employees at the processing facilities to ignore the obviously sand-filled crushed cars. Between 2014 and his arrest in 2015, authorities estimated that Carmine made approximately $3 million from this racket. The arrest made headlines across the country. Photographs showed Carmine in a plain white t-shirt and jeans, being cuffed by Cleveland detectives and NYPD detective Lynn McCarthy against the backdrop of his Ohio scrapyard. A stark black and yellow sign reading, "Guard Dog on Duty," was visible in the background. In 2017, Carmine accepted another plea deal that involved a large fine but no prison time. He'd managed to avoid going back to jail, but the arrest was a reminder that he would never escape the life that had defined him. Back in Old Westbury, Victoria had been trying for years to sell the mansion. She first listed it in 2008 for $3.5 million, a price that reflected both the property's size and its notorious history. But the timing was terrible. The 2008 financial crisis had crashed the real estate market, and nobody wanted to pay millions for a mob-connected mansion. In 2009, Victoria fell behind on her mortgage payments, and the house was threatened with foreclosure. She managed to save it that time, but over the next several years, the property was listed and delisted from the market 7 different times as Victoria struggled to find a buyer. She eventually dropped the asking price to $2.4 million, then lower still. But the Gotti name was both an attraction and a curse. Some potential buyers were intrigued by the property's history, but most were scared off by the attention it would bring. Who wants to live in a house that everyone in New York knows belonged to John Gotti's daughter? The mansion sat on the market, year after year, slowly becoming more of a burden than an asset. Then, on a Wednesday in September 2016, federal agents showed up with search warrants. The raid on Victoria's Old Westbury mansion was coordinated with a simultaneous raid on an auto parts store in Queens that was run by Victoria's 3 sons. The auto parts business was technically owned by Carmine Agnello Sr., but he had turned it over to his sons to operate while he was dealing with his own legal problems in Ohio. The raids were part of an investigation being conducted by the Brooklyn U.S. Attorney's Office, specifically from the tax fraud section, and the case had originated with the IRS. Sources told reporters that Victoria's sons, not Victoria herself, appeared to be the targets of the investigation. Federal prosecutors were looking into whether the sons were involved in tax fraud related to the auto parts business. There was also a connection to a 2015 trial of Bonanno mobster Vincent Asaro, during which a cooperating witness had secretly recorded a conversation inside the auto parts store on Liberty Avenue. The recordings hadn't been enough to convict Asaro, who was found not guilty, but they'd apparently given federal investigators enough to justify further scrutiny of the Gotti family's business dealings. Victoria wasn't home when the raid happened, which was probably fortunate for everyone involved. The feds would have had to deal with her famous temper and her ability to deliver devastating sound bites to the media that always seemed to portray law enforcement as the villains harassing an innocent family. Instead, agents moved through the mansion methodically, searching for documents, financial records, anything that might prove tax fraud or other crimes. They went through the bedrooms where Victoria's sons had grown up, the kitchen where she'd filmed scenes for her reality show, the bathrooms with their gold fixtures, the living rooms with their expensive furniture. They looked through drawers and closets, examined paperwork scattered on countertops, and photographed everything. When they were done, the mansion looked like it had been turned over by a tornado. Papers were everywhere. Doors had been left open or removed. The kitchen island was covered with scattered documents. A broken door was propped in the corner. The FBI's work was left exactly as it was when the agents departed. A frozen moment of chaos that would remain untouched for years. The family never came back. After the raid, Victoria and her sons abandoned the Old Westbury mansion completely. They walked away from millions of dollars worth of property and possessions, leaving behind almost everything they owned. It was as if the raid had finally broken whatever attachment they had to the place. This house had been Victoria's home for over 30 years. It was where she'd raised her boys, where she'd filmed her television show, where the family had celebrated countless holidays and birthdays. But after federal agents walked through it with search warrants, the mansion felt contaminated somehow, tainted by the same law enforcement scrutiny that had destroyed her father's life and her ex-husband's freedom. So they left. They took what they needed and abandoned the rest, leaving the 6,000 square foot property to sit empty month after month, year after year, while nature slowly reclaimed what had once been immaculate grounds. The aftermath of the raid brought mixed results for the family. In 2018, Carmine Agnello Jr. accepted a plea deal for operating an illegal scrap metal yard, the same kind of crime his father had built a career on. Carmine Jr. managed to avoid jail time by paying a fine of $1,000, a slap on the wrist compared to what could have happened. His lawyer, Stephen Mahler, claimed his client was a legitimate businessman who had simply been caught in between licenses. The actual truth was more complicated. Carmine Jr.'s license had expired in 2016, right around the time of the FBI raid, and he had withdrawn his application for a new license shortly afterward. Whether this was coincidence or part of a larger strategy to distance himself from scrutiny was unclear. What was clear was that the Gotti family's connection to the scrap metal business, which had caused so much trouble for Carmine Sr., was still causing problems for the next generation. The abandoned mansion became a target for urban explorers and YouTubers who specialized in documenting empty properties. In the years following the 2016 raid, multiple videographers made the journey to Old Westbury to see what remained of the Gotti family's once grand estate. Kyle McGran, a YouTuber known for exploring abandoned locations, produced one of the most comprehensive tours of the property. His video showed a mansion frozen in time, filled with the everyday possessions of a family who had left in a hurry and never returned. The butterfly staircase still stood in the grand foyer, though dust now covered the marble floors and the gold-trimmed chandeliers hung dark and lifeless. Hundreds of books remained on the built-in shelves, their spines faded but still legible. Furniture sat exactly where it had been placed years earlier. Leather couches, ornate chairs, dining room sets, and bedroom furniture all remained, as if the family might walk back in at any moment. In the bedrooms, closets still held designer clothes hanging on racks. Gucci suits, high-end dresses, expensive shoes, all left behind. The kitchen cabinet still had dishes inside, plates and glasses that Victoria had used to serve meals to her family and guests. In one of the downstairs bathrooms, artwork hung on the walls, apparently not valuable enough to take when the family fled. Throughout the house, personal items were scattered everywhere. Family photos showed happier times when the boys were young and the future seemed bright. A liquor cabinet stood fully stocked with expensive bottles that no one would ever drink on the kitchen island. Amid scattered paperwork, Kyle McGran discovered something particularly poignant during his exploration. It was a script, apparently written by Victoria Gotti, titled The Senator's Daughter. She had been working on new projects, new stories, new ways to build a career beyond her father's shadow, and she'd left it all behind when the federal agents came. Outside, the decay was even more dramatic. The triple-level pool complex, which had once been the crown jewel of the property's outdoor amenities, was now filled with algae-green water. The pool hadn't been cleaned or maintained in years, and what had once been crystal-clear water, suitable for entertaining guests, was now a stagnant breeding ground for mosquitoes. The waterfall features were dry and cracked. The swim-up bar, where you could once order drinks without leaving the pool, sat empty and deteriorating. The basketball court was overgrown with weeds pushing up through the cracks in the concrete. Bushes and trees that had once been carefully manicured now grew wild, consuming pathways and covering windows. The horse stable stood empty, the unfinished in-law apartment above it still unfinished, a project that would never be completed. Most bizarrely, several old cars were found stashed around the property among the overgrown shrubs, their bodies rusting and their tires flat, vehicles that had once transported the Gotti family around Long Island, now left to decay like everything else. The guest house yielded the most dramatic discovery. Kyle McGran and other urban explorers who visited the property found something that most people would never have noticed. On the second floor of the guest house, hidden behind a built-in bookshelf that looked like just another piece of furniture, was a hinged door. The bookshelf had been constructed to swing open like a door, revealing a secret room behind it. The room wasn't large, maybe the size of a walk-in closet, but it was fitted with a sophisticated keypad locking mechanism that suggested it had once contained something valuable. By the time the YouTubers found it, the room was being used for storage. It was filled with clothes on hangers, piles of additional clothing, old DVDs, and personal photographs. One explorer found a card that had been written by Victoria Gotti, a personal touch that made the discovery feel intrusive and sad at the same time. The secret room became the centerpiece of every video tour of the mansion, the detail that confirmed what everyone wanted to believe about the Gotti property. It was a mob house, complete with hidden rooms and secret spaces, even if those spaces had ultimately been used for nothing more sinister than storing off-season clothing. What the secret room said about the family's mindset was more interesting than what it actually contained. Why build a room with a keypad lock behind a hidden bookshelf? Unless you expect to need to hide something important? The most obvious answer is that Carmine Agnello, who oversaw the construction and renovation of the house in the mid-90s, wanted to have a place where he could stash cash, documents, or other items that he didn't want anyone to find. Every mob associate and soldier understood that your house could be raided at any time. Evidence needed to be hidden where casual searches wouldn't find it. But Carmine wasn't sophisticated enough to anticipate that a hidden room behind a bookshelf with a keypad is exactly the kind of thing that federal agents are trained to look for. If the FBI had found the room during their 2016 raid, and if there had been anything incriminating inside, it would have been used against the family in court. The fact that the room's biggest secret by 2016 was a collection of designer clothes and old family photos suggests that either Carmine had stopped using it for anything illegal years earlier, or that someone had cleaned it out before the family abandoned the property. The mansion sat abandoned and deteriorating for 6 full years after the 2016 raid. During that time, Victoria continued to struggle with the property financially. She was still technically the owner, but she wasn't living there and wasn't maintaining it. And the unpaid mortgage and property taxes continued to pile up. The lender, likely exhausted from years of Victoria's financial difficulties, finally initiated foreclosure proceedings. On October 26, 2022, the old Westbury mansion was put up for auction at a foreclosure sale. Properties sold at foreclosure rarely bring in anything close to their actual market value, and this case was no exception. The highest bid came from J.P. Morgan Chase National Bank, one of the largest financial institutions in America, which acquired the property for $2,650,000. On December 7, 2022, the deed was officially transferred to the bank. A property that Victoria had once tried to sell for $3.5 million, that had cost millions to build and furnish, and that represented decades of family history, was now owned by a bank that simply wanted to recoup its losses and move on. J.P. Morgan Chase wasn't interested in keeping the property long-term. Banks aren't in the real estate business. They're in the lending business. And when they end up owning properties through foreclosure, their goal is to sell them as quickly as possible and move the asset off their books. In late 2024, the bank successfully sold the old Westbury mansion for $1.1 million, less than half of what they'd paid for it at the foreclosure auction just 2 years earlier, and barely a third of what Victoria had originally listed it for in 2008. The precipitous drop in value reflected the toll that 6 years of abandonment had taken on the property. The pool was ruined. The landscaping was destroyed. The house itself, while structurally sound, needed extensive repairs and renovation to be livable again. More than that, the property carried the stigma of its history. This wasn't just any mansion. This was the Gotti Mansion, the place where Growing Up Gotti had been filmed, the home of John Gotti's daughter and grandchildren. For some buyers, that history was fascinating. For most, it was baggage they didn't want to carry. When Kim Gotti, the wife of John Jr. Gotti and Victoria's sister-in-law, heard about the $1.1 million sale price, she was stunned. "It's a steal for that house," she told reporters. She remembered the mansion in its glory days, when it had been the center of family gatherings and holiday celebrations, when Victoria had everything decorated perfectly and the grounds were immaculate. "It was magnificent. It was gorgeous," she said wistfully. "It was where all the holidays were. Christmas, Thanksgiving, Easter. It's amazing how life just goes so quick." Her words captured something essential about the Gotti story. Everything had fallen apart so quickly. One day you're living in a mansion worth millions, filming a reality TV show and celebrating with your family. The next day, federal agents are raiding your home and you're abandoning everything you've built because the weight of the past has finally become too heavy to carry. The public reaction to the abandoned mansion was mixed. Some people couldn't understand why the family would simply walk away from so much wealth. Comments on YouTube videos of the property expressed bewilderment and frustration. One user wrote, "Why doesn't the government invest money to fix this mansion up and sell it? They could make a couple $100,000 in profit. This is such a waste of taxpayers' money." Another commented, "What a shame. So many people with nothing and you abandoned this place? Really? How rude." A third wrote, "I'd buy it. Why just up and leave, leaving so many things behind?" These reactions reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to live under the kind of pressure that comes with the Gotti name. To the casual observer, walking away from a mansion seems insane. But to Victoria and her sons, that mansion represented everything that had gone wrong in their lives. It represented her father dying in prison, her ex-husband's repeated incarcerations, the constant scrutiny from law enforcement, and the impossibility of ever escaping the legacy of organized crime that defined their family. Walking away wasn't crazy. Staying would have been. Victoria has tried, over the years, to push back against the narrative that her life was easy or glamorous. In a 2019 interview, she said, "The preconceived notions about my life that I would like to change is that I think the whole aura that life was so easy and I was this princess all my life. It was anything but that. I grew up very poor. I don't know what this whole princess business is about." She was right, at least partially. John Gotti didn't become wealthy until the mid-1980s. When Victoria was already in her 20s, her childhood in Howard Beach had been modest, and the opulent lifestyle people associate with the Gotti name came later and lasted for a relatively short period before the arrests and convictions destroyed everything. But Victoria's protestations ring a bit hollow when you consider that she spent decades living in a 6,000-square-foot mansion with gold-plated bathroom fixtures and a triple-level pool complex. She may not have felt like a princess, but to most Americans struggling to pay rent, her life looked pretty charmed. The cultural impact of the old Westbury mansion extends beyond the family that lived there. The property became a symbol of a particular moment in American culture, when mob families transitioned from being shadowy criminal figures to being reality television stars. Growing Up Gotti premiered in 2004 during the early years of the reality TV boom, and it offered viewers something they'd never seen before. Previous depictions of organized crime, from The Godfather to The Sopranos, had been fictionalized and dramatized. Growing Up Gotti showed real people with the most famous mob name in America living their actual lives, dealing with mundane problems like dating and college applications alongside the unique pressures of their family legacy. The show was controversial from the start. Some critics argued that it glamorized the mafia and made criminals seem like normal, even sympathetic people. Others saw it as a fascinating sociological document about how the children and grandchildren of mobsters navigate their inheritance. The mansion itself became a character on the show, its opulent interiors and lavish amenities providing a backdrop that reinforced both the privilege and the prison of being a Gotti. The property's story also reflects broader changes in how law enforcement pursues organized crime. In John Gotti's day, the FBI focused on catching mobsters in the act of committing crimes, like murder and racketeering. They used wiretaps and surveillance to build cases that required proving specific violent acts. By the time Victoria's sons were being investigated in 2016, the approach had shifted. Federal prosecutors focused increasingly on financial crimes, tax fraud, and money laundering because these cases were easier to prove and harder to defend against. You can argue about whether someone was involved in a murder conspiracy, but you can't argue with bank records and tax returns that don't match. The raid on the old Westbury mansion wasn't about finding guns or drugs or evidence of violence. It was about finding documents that would prove tax fraud, the same kind of financial crime that had helped bring down Al Capone nearly a century earlier. The Gottis, like so many other criminal families, ultimately fell not to law enforcement's bullets, but to their accountants' mistakes. There's a certain poetic justice in how the mansion's story ended. John Gotti spent his entire adult life building a criminal empire, defying law enforcement and cultivating an image as the untouchable Teflon Don. He accumulated millions of dollars and wielded enormous power over New York's underworld. But he died in a prison cell at age 61. And 20 years after his death, his daughter's mansion was sold at a massive loss to pay off debts. His grandchildren, the 3 boys he never got to see grow up, ended up running scrap metal businesses just like their father, repeating the same mistakes and facing the same kinds of criminal charges. The old Westbury mansion, which should have been a monument to the family's success, instead became a monument to how everything falls apart. The gold-plated fixtures tarnished, the marble floors collected dust, the pool filled with algae. And eventually, the bank came and took it all away, just like they do to everyone who can't pay their mortgage. The mansion's fate also raises uncomfortable questions about wealth, legacy, and what we leave behind. Victoria Gotti spent years building that property into something beautiful. She decorated it with care, filled it with books and art, and tried to create a home where her sons could have normal lives despite their extraordinary family name. In the end, all of that effort meant nothing. The mansion was abandoned, foreclosed on, and sold for a fraction of its value to someone who probably plans to gut the interior and erase all traces of the family that lived there. Future owners will likely remove the gold-plated faucets and the marble and all the other touches that Victoria chose so carefully. They'll renovate the secret room and turn it into a regular closet, or maybe remove it entirely. The butterfly staircase might remain because it's a structural element, but everything else that made the house, specifically the Gotti mansion, will be erased. In a decade or two, tourists might drive past the property and have no idea that John Gotti's daughter once lived there, that Growing Up Gotti was filmed in those rooms, or that a secret room behind a bookshelf once held the family's most valuable possessions. The broader lesson of the old Westbury mansion is about the impossibility of escaping your past through real estate. Victoria thought that she could create a new life for herself and her sons by building a beautiful home in an upscale neighborhood far from the working-class streets of Howard Beach and Ozone Park, where the Gotti story began. She thought that decorating in the style of the Ritz-Carlton and sending her boys to good schools and filming a reality TV show would allow her family to transcend their history and become just another wealthy American family. But you can't escape organized crime by buying a nicer house. The FBI will still come with search warrants. Neighbors will still whisper and point. Potential buyers will still be scared off by your last name. And eventually, when the financial house of cards built on criminal enterprises collapses, you'll lose the mansion just like everyone else loses their house when they can't pay the mortgage. The old Westbury property was supposed to be proof that Victoria had made it, that she'd escaped her father's legacy and built something solid and permanent. Instead, it became just another abandoned building with a dark history. One more piece of evidence that the mob life destroys everything it touches, even 3 generations later. What happened to Victoria and her sons after they abandoned the mansion remains somewhat mysterious. Victoria has continued to write and occasionally appears in media interviews, usually to defend her father's legacy or to complain about how the family has been treated by law enforcement and the press. She published several books, including romance novels and memoirs. And in 2019, Lifetime aired a biopic called Victoria Gotti, My Father's Daughter, that told her story through her relationship with John Gotti. The movie portrayed Victoria as a sympathetic figure trapped between love for her father and the damage his choices inflicted on the family. Reviews were mixed. Some viewers found Victoria's story compelling. Others thought the movie whitewashed John Gotti's crimes and presented him as more of a folk hero than the murderous racketeer he actually was. Victoria served as a producer on the film, which meant she had significant control over how the story was told. Unsurprisingly, the version presented on screen was far more flattering than the version presented in FBI files and court documents. The 3 Gotti boys, Carmine Jr., John, and Frank, have kept lower profiles than their mother. Carmine Jr.'s 2018 plea deal for operating an illegal scrap metal yard suggests that he, like his father before him, struggled to stay out of the criminal enterprises that had defined his family for generations. Whether he's continued in the scrap metal business or found legitimate work is unclear. John and Frank have also largely stayed out of the headlines, which is probably the smartest choice any of them could make. Growing up with the Gotti name means that law enforcement will always be watching, always looking for any sign that you're following in your grandfather's footsteps. The smart move is to live quietly, work legitimately, and avoid giving prosecutors any reason to bring charges. Whether Victoria's sons have actually managed to break the cycle that destroyed their grandfather and their father remains to be seen. History suggests it's difficult. The criminal life has a gravity that pulls families in for generations, and the Gotti name carries more baggage than most. As for the old Westbury mansion itself, its new owner faces an interesting challenge. The property has good bones, a solid structure on valuable Long Island real estate in an excellent school district and an upscale neighborhood. With enough money and effort, it could be renovated back into a showcase property worth several $million. But doing so requires erasing the Gotti connection, or at least downplaying it significantly. The new owner will need to decide whether to embrace the property's history or to bury it. Some buyers might see the Gotti connection as a selling point, a piece of authentic organized crime history that makes the property unique. Others will want to strip away every trace of the family that lived there and turn it into just another expensive suburban mansion with no particular story attached. The secret room will probably be discovered during renovations and removed. Its sophisticated locking mechanism and hidden entrance replaced with conventional construction. The pool will need to be drained, cleaned, and possibly completely rebuilt. The landscaping will require thousands of dollars and countless hours to return to its former glory. It's a massive undertaking, and it remains to be seen whether the new owner has the resources and the will to complete it. The story of the old Westbury Mansion is, in the end, a story about the American dream twisted into something grotesque. John Gotti came from nothing, grew up in poverty, and built an empire through violence and crime. He achieved wealth and power beyond anything his parents could have imagined. But he died in prison and left his family with nothing but debts and a famous name that caused more problems than it solved. His daughter tried to build a legitimate life, to be a writer and a television personality, to raise her sons in comfort and safety. She bought a mansion, decorated it beautifully, and tried to create the kind of home that said she'd made it, that the Gotti family had finally arrived. But the mansion couldn't protect her from the consequences of her father's choices and her husband's crimes. When the FBI came in September 2016, all the gold-plated faucets and marble floors and secret rooms couldn't keep her safe. She abandoned the property and never looked back, leaving behind millions of dollars worth of possessions because staying would have been unbearable. The old Westbury Mansion now stands as a memorial to the futility of trying to escape the past through material success. It's a reminder that no matter how much money you have, no matter how beautiful your house is, no matter how far you move from the old neighborhood, you can't run from who you are and where you came from. The Gotti name opened doors for Victoria and her family, giving them access to wealth and opportunities that most people never get. But it also closed doors, marking them forever as the children and grandchildren of a murderer and racketeer, ensuring that they would never be judged on their own merits, but always in the shadow of John Gotti's legacy. The mansion was supposed to be proof that they'd transcended that legacy, that they'd become more than just another mob family. Instead, it became evidence of exactly the opposite. One more abandoned property with a dark history, one more crime scene that tells a story about how the American dream curdles when it's built on blood money and broken laws. On that Wednesday morning in September 2016, when federal agents surrounded the property at 6 Birch Hill Court, they weren't just executing a search warrant. They were closing a chapter in American organized crime history that had begun decades earlier in the streets of Ozone Park and Howard Beach. John Gotti's empire had collapsed long ago, but its aftershocks continued to reverberate through his family's life. The raid on Victoria's mansion was one of those aftershocks, a reminder that you never really escape, that the FBI never really forgets, and that the price of the life John Gotti chose in the 1960s was still being paid by his grandchildren in the 21st century. The family abandoned the mansion that day and never came back, leaving behind the butterfly staircase and the gold chandeliers and the secret room and the algae-filled pool and all the other remnants of a life they could no longer afford to live, either financially or emotionally. The property sat empty for 6 years, slowly decaying until finally a bank took ownership and sold it to someone new, someone without the Gotti name, someone who could walk through those rooms without being haunted by ghosts. Today, if you drive through Old Westbury and pass by 6 Birch Hill Court, you might not even notice the property. It looks like just another expensive mansion in an expensive neighborhood, remarkable only for its size and its location. But if you knew to look closer, if you knew the history, you'd see more than just a house. You'd see the place where John Gotti's daughter tried and failed to build a normal life. You'd see the location where Growing Up Gotti was filmed, where 3 boys with the most famous mob name in America rode ATVs and threw parties and tried to pretend they were just like everyone else. You'd see the property that John Gotti himself never actually lived in, but that became inextricably linked to his legacy anyway. Because his daughter lived there, and his grandchildren grew up there, and his name hung over everything like a cloud. You'd see a mansion that should have been worth millions, but sold for barely $1 million, because nobody wants to live in a house where the FBI might show up with search warrants at any moment. And if you looked hard enough, maybe you'd still be able to find the secret room behind the bookshelf. The hidden space that symbolizes everything the Gotti family tried to keep concealed, but couldn't. Because in the end, every secret gets discovered. Every hidden room gets opened, and every past catches up with you. No matter how far you run or how big a house you build to hide in.